Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a babyface killer mask from the film Happy Death Day. So let's get into it. When you're sculpting a mask, you need something to sculpt it over. So I'm going to be using this solid plaster life cast of myself. The beauty of a mask like the Babyface Killer from Happy Death Day is it's not a form-fitting mask. So as long as you've got something that's roughly the size and shape of your head with the eye holes in the right place, you can use that as a form. So for example, these polystyrene or styrofoam heads, as long as they're pretty close to the size of your head and the eyes are pretty much in proportion, you could use something like that to sculpt on. Another option that you can do is grab yourself one of these cheap masks from a party store. The shape is the right size and shape for my face, but obviously if I started to sculpt on top of that, it's going to buckle and distort. So what I could do is put some duct tape over the eye and nose holes on the outside, and then put it into something like some wet towels or something like that to just support and cradle that outside shape. And then you could just pour in some plaster of Paris into the middle and then ultimately either pop off the plastic shell or cut it and remove it. And you'll actually end up with something that is pretty much like the life cast. The next choice we've got to make is what we're actually going to sculpt in. Now there's two choices here, and I use both of these for different purposes. So the first choice is an oil-based sculpting clay. This is a great product to work with because it doesn't dry out. You can start a sculpture, you can walk away from it for years, and when you come back it will be exactly as you left it and you can continue sculpting. The downside of it is that it's not as easy to get a really good finish with. It definitely has its place for some types of sculpting, but it's not what I'm going to use for this particular project. So what I'm going to use is a clay called Wed Clay, W-E-D. It's very soft and very smooth and really easy to get a good finish on. But it does have one big disadvantage. Similar to river clay, it is synthetic, but similar to river clay, wet clay does dry out. So while you're sculpting it, you need to continually give it a spritz of water with a spray bottle like this, and just keep the surface of it hydrated, and that will help you to keep working the surface to get a really good finish. Also, if you're going to leave the sculpture for any period of time, you need to cover it in plastic wrap so that it doesn't dry out while you're gone. You can come back, give it a bit of a spritz with water, and then continue later. But if you're really going to be leaving it for any length of time, I wouldn't recommend the wet clay. I would recommend that you go for the oil-based clay. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just wet down my plaster mold. Now, I've had oil-based clay on this before, so the surface of my mold will bead a little bit like that, but if you've got a fresh plaster mold, that moisture will absorb into it and it will stop it from sucking too much of the moisture out from the clay. So now I can take my clay and I can start to apply that onto my form and just start to rough out the shape, so I don't have to worry about any detail at the moment. Now the wet clay, as long as you've stored it in an airtight container, you can actually reuse it over and over again. The only thing that will really stop you from using it is if you let it get too dry or too dirty. So if you've pulled a mold and there's chunks of plaster or resin or anything, you really want to pick those out so that they don't mess up your clay. So I store mine in a 20-litre pail with a nice tight fitting seal, and I've used this clay over and over again. Using the eyes as a guide where the pupils are going to be, I'm just going to start to mark some of the shapes. Another thing that I tend to do is concentrate more on one side than the other. The reason for this is once you've got one side looking good, it's easy to copy it for symmetry, whereas if you're trying to balance it and get it right on both sides at the same time, it's actually much harder. So now that I've got the sculpt pretty much half roughed out, I've printed out some reference photos, and what I've done is I've taken a photo of the sculpt as it is at the moment, and then I've superimposed a picture of the actual mask, and I've printed it out with through Photoshop with various degrees of opacity on that top layer so that I can see exactly how it falls over my sculpt. And basically what it shows me is that my sculpt is too narrow, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to build out the sides. Using a piece of foam dipped in water, we can now smooth out the surface of the clay. To do the smaller areas like the eyes, I cut a wedge shape from my foam and then round off the edge of the wedge so that I can get into all of the small corners. I've mixed some mold making silicone, and using a chip brush I can carefully apply my first coat, being careful not to add any brush strokes into the sculpture. I let this set and then add a second coat of silicone. When this is set, we can apply our third and final coat of silicone. The next step is to make a mother mold. Now the mother mold is a supportive jacket that we put on over the silicone so that when we peel the silicone off the sculpture we can lay it back inside the mother mold, and the rigid mother mold supports the shape of it so it doesn't distort while we pour in our resin. So I've mixed up a batch of cheap casting plaster to a creamy consistency, and I'm just going to smear that all over the silicone. First, the mother mold has come off, so we can pop that one aside. And now we can very carefully peel up our silicone. I've washed out the silicone mold, and now I'm going to just get some scissors and cut away these little edges off the flashing. Right, so we can pop the silicone back into the mother mold now and align it again. We've now got our negative mold. So from the negative mold we can pour in our resin, which is what we're going to make the actual finished mask out of. So the resin that I use is polyurethane resin, and it's fantastic stuff to work with. It's a 1-to-1 mix, and it has an amazingly fast cure time of like around about 8 minutes. Pour it into my mold. I won't pour all of it in just yet, and I'm going to get another little chip brush, give it a bit of a flick, and then I'm going to start to brush the resin up into all the details and coat the entire inside surface. And it doesn't matter if I get any on this top sort of flange, but I don't want too much resin in here because that's going to all pool at the bottom, and then the nose will fill up, the forehead will fill up. Now for the next couple of minutes, to stop it from pooling in the nose and forehead areas, I'm going to start to just rotate the mould. This is the tedious part, but by rotating the mould I can get all the excess out of the low-lying areas, and then I just need to keep rotating the mould for a few more minutes until it starts to set. So this layer is pretty much touch dry now, so now I'll go back and pour another layer. So I'll probably go for 4 or 5 layers. We don't want it to be too fragile, so I'll go for another layer now. And you can actually see some of the detail around the eye sockets are starting to disappear, so certainly in that area there it's actually building up quite a thick layer. But where the weaknesses will be is up around the sides, and we need to attach the elastic as well here, so we want to get some reasonable thickness around that outer sort of perimeter. I think actually 4 coats is probably going to be enough for this mask, but what I am going to do is I'm going to mix up another batch and I'm going to let it almost set, and then I'm going to smear it around the top edge. Our resin cast has now set, so we can pretty much repeat the process of demolding by removing the plaster shell first. Now we can peel off the silicone. Now this little flashing here will just break away quite easily. So here's our mask with a base coat of a light pink flesh colour, and I've also used a Dremel tool to cut out the eye holes and the nostrils. So now it's ready for painting on the rest of the features. I'm going to use some of these alcohol activated inks. These are actually a makeup product, but they set like an acrylic paint, but you could water down just an ordinary acrylic paint and use that if you like. This stuff is activated with isopropyl alcohol, so I'm going to pick a nice light colour. So I just buy these sets of cheap paintbrushes, because when you're working with spray paints and things, the brushes are going to be no good by the end of it. And I just want to go with the lightest sort of wash that I can, just to get a little bit of pink into those cheeks, and I'll buff a lot of it back off. And the key with doing this sort of thing is you want to build up your colours in sort of layers. Don't add too much at any one time. Now I'm going to get the first coat of white into the eyeballs and the black into the mouth. I'm actually going to use a spray paint, and I'm going to just spray a little bit of the white into the bottom of a cup. to start dirtying the mask. And to do that, I'm going to use some acrylic paint, and I'm going to water it down quite a lot. I'm going to take a kitchen sponge and bunch it up and just dab it into a little bit of the brown paint and then onto the mask. We don't want to put too much on at any one time. We want to build up layers of dirt. So now that we've got most of the paintwork done, the next step is going to be to put in the scratches around the cheeks and the chin. I'm going to use this tiny little file here and scratch in the shapes that we need. Because the brown acrylic paint that we use to stipple on the dirt will wear off quite easily, what I'm going to do is use a coat of a clear satin sealer, and I'm going to spray that over to lock everything down and protect it. I'm really happy with the overall finish now, and it's locked in all of those different layers of different types of paint and inks. So now there's a mesh that I've got from a hardware store which is sold as a garden windbreak material. So I've cut a couple of little squares which I'm going to glue onto the inside of the eyes, and a little strip which I'll glue onto the inside of the nostrils. And it allows you to see out pretty well, but it just gives a little bit of shading to the eyes and nostrils so that you can't see back in. So I'll just put a little band a bit further out from the eye, and then very carefully, so I don't burn myself, I'll just press that into that hot glue. One last thing left to do now, put on an elastic strap. I'm going to use these little two-piece push-together rivets. And a little trick for when you're drilling through polyurethane resin is if you put the drill in reverse, it's less likely to chip the resin. Drill a hole on each side, just above the ears. Okay, so I'm going to cut a nice clean end on the elastic, and then what I'll do is fold it over, and I'm going to take a tiny little nick to allow the rivet to pass through the elastic. And then we'll get the long side of the rivet, pop that through, pop the elastic over there, and then get the cap and we'll pop that over. And then the quickest, easiest way is just to use a pair of pliers and just squeeze and crimp that rivet closed. So now I need to measure the amount of elastic to go around my head. Now I don't want this too tight, because it's going to become quite uncomfortable if it's pushed against my face, but I also don't want it too loose so that it flops around. So just measure a tiny bit of stretch on the elastic, and then we can cut that off. And we'll do the same thing with this rivet. Find the spots where there's a bit of pressure inside, and I found a photo here of the screen used mask, and what they've done is they've put some padding, it looks like, just on the front of the forehead, and they've put a little bit on the chin. So I'm going to use some of this foam and I'm going to hot glue that in. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to make a babyface killer mask from Happy Death Day. If you've got any questions or comments or ideas on future videos that you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos.